thank you so much for being here today. And I want to say, ooh, I'm usually too short for these things, so it's kind of a miracle I had to push that one up. I want to just say thank you to Peter so much for inviting me here today and for hosting such an incredible event where we're given a platform to talk about these issues. Democracy is something that we hear about a lot as students. In grade 10, we're taught civics, not in great detail, but enough to understand what a democracy is supposed to be. Oh, am I supposed to talk louder? Is that, okay. Sorry, just wanted to check. And I guess there's two sides of me that I could share today, which is more of the radical activist side and more of the censored side, but I do feel that the activist side of me is a little bit more fun. I've been an activist for about 9 years now. I started at the age of 11 when I accidentally ran across the acronyms GMO. Growing up vegetarian, I always thought that the food I was eating was healthier, that I was morally superior to others because I was eating healthy food, I was supporting the environment, I was helping animals. I didn't think twice about where my food came from. I didn't think about the pesticides used, I didn't think about the farmers, what they were exposed to. I didn't think about the impact on climate. I didn't think about the impact on my own health. And that all changed after I found out about our food system. And I hope to enlighten a little bit today about how my journey learning about our food system has led me to understand how truly broken our democracy is. It's difficult to go after Jane. She is such an incredible inspiration to, I think, every single one of us in this room. And she mentioned industrial agriculture. When I found out that GMOs were linked to a variety of health and environmental issues, I became extremely concerned with what I was putting in my body. Ingredients like corn, canola, soy, sugar from sugar beet, yellow squash, zucchini, Hawaiian papaya, things in our everyday foods that you would never think of, that we eat with every single meal. I didn't understand the implications until I began research and understanding that I was eating this every day and that in less than 3 decades, a handful of multinational corporations had found a way to basically patent and own our entire food system. GMOs are genetically modified organisms, and it's where they take DNA from one species and insert it into another to introduce a new trait. I'm not going to get into the very science and technical things with you, but there are a lot of problems surrounding ownership of seed, and the seed sovereignty and the fact that farmers are no longer allowed to save these seeds for generation after generation. They now have to buy from the corporations year after year along with the chemicals that go along with them. And what concerned me the most was the fact that Canada and the US were the only 2 industrialized nations in the entire world that don't require mandatory GMO labeling. 64 other countries around the world already do. And yet, here, in a democratic nation, we are denied the basic right to choose the foods that we put in our bodies. That seemed counterintuitive to me, and that's when I decided to take action. Like with all forms of action, everything starts off small. And for me, it began with starting a Twitter account called @Rachel'sNews, which you can still follow me on, and then creating our first Kids Right to Know March with the goal of informing young kids and adults alike about the impacts of our food system. And that led to then creating Kids Right to Know, our nonprofit. It's been an incredible journey so far, but what I've learned along the way is the amount of corporate infiltration within our government, within our food system, is astounding. Our food system has really become the face of corporate and political fraud at this point. Farmers were told that they needed to grow genetically modified foods in order to save the populations, to feed the world, to save the blind, to save climate change, all of these massive ideas in which none of them are true. Study after study has shown that crop yields are not increased, that climate change is actually being expedited by industrial agriculture, which I will get to. Pesticide use is continuously increasing, and our health is declining as a society. These are all problems that we're seeing, and more, we have to start to question our food system. For instance, the first genetically modified animal has been released. It is the genetically modified salmon, and it is mixed with DNA from eel as well as various other forms of DNA. And not only do our tax dollars go to pay this, since the Canadian government invested heavily to make genetically modified salmon a reality, but it is now considered one of the greatest environmental threats that we have to natural salmon. If this salmon is ever released into nature, because it grows twice as fast and twice as aggressive, it has the ability to contaminate all natural salmon, all of our oceans, our rivers, and they are a keystone species. And this is just one example. Genetic pollution is one of the greatest threats to biodiversity that we have. And when we patent seeds and they end up in different farmers' fields, not only are those farmers sued for infringing on patent rights, but their land can be taken away. These foods are now infringing on human rights, on environmental rights, on our own personal sovereignty, because we aren't allowed the right to choose the food that we put in our bodies. Our food system is contributing so greatly to climate change as well. And this is something that I'd like to talk about a little bit. I've been involved in the youth climate movement for some time now. Before climate change became the topic to talk about, we were all concerned about the science. We were all concerned about the issues. And we have to understand that if we are going to address these problems, we need to address the root causes. Industrial agriculture contributes 44 to 57% of all greenhouse gas emissions. That's more than transportation, that is more than manufacturing, and that is more than producing. And unless our democratic nation, unless our democratic government gets behind these messages and understands that unless they take vital action to fix our agricultural system, true change won't come. We can talk about fossil fuels all we want, but unless we start to address things that we can do right away, such as regenerative agriculture that actually can take down carbon, we won't get anywhere. And my criticism of the government doesn't come lightly. I have had my experience. I'm not just a social media activist, and I've had the honor of working with officials and lobbying, quote unquote. And it's been an interesting story for me. My first very public form of activism came in the fact of challenging Kevin O'Leary after he said that anyone marching against Monsanto was stupid, and that if they didn't like GMOs, they should just stop eating. And I couldn't let that one go. I really had a tough time. So I challenged him to publicly debate me on television, and CBC had never, at that point, had more requests to have anybody on any show. And it was such an incredible honor. I never expected him to accept. And that's what began my interest in democracy and in the freedom of speech and in journalism. I'm a second-year journalism student actually here at Ryerson. He said, "How did Kevin do against me?" I'll let you guys decide. You can watch it online. But it was definitely an experience. Behind the scenes was a little bit different from what you see. There was definitely a condescending tone of hearing, "You're doing great, kiddo," on the commercial breaks. But it taught me a lot. It taught me a lot about standing up and calling people out. And I think that if we're ever going to address this issue of democracy, this issue of corruption, we can't skirt around the issues anymore. There's no time to be polite in our messaging. There is no time to be talking just about the theory without action. And that's where my political action started, where I began to challenge ministers to speak with me. And one of the things that I experienced was the amount of lies that I was told along the way. I met with the Minister of Health, Rona Ambrose, quite some time ago, and she said that if there were ever concerns around issues like glyphosate or Roundup, which is the most commonly used herbicide in the world, over 300 million pounds of glyphosate are sprayed every single year in the US alone, and it is a proven carcinogen now. There's over 18,000 cases against Monsanto of people whose non-Hodgkin's lymphoma was caused by Roundup. And I was told by this Minister of Health that if there were ever concerns to us as citizens, if there was ever concerns to the environment, that she would take action and that they would ban Roundup. Well, Roundup is still on the shelves. It is still being sold for people to use on lawns, and is still the most commonly used herbicide in our food system that we are eating every single day, not just on genetically modified foods, but on regular foods as well, like wheat and lentils, chickpeas, as a desiccant to dry before harvest. So unless you're by chance eating organic, you are most likely having glyphosate in 3 meals a day, every single day. And these are big concerns for our health and the environment. I also met with a minister who's based out of Alberta, And he and I were talking about why it's important to have the right to know what's in our food. And he was very much against this GMO labeling bill that was in Congress, in the Parliament. And what he told me is that even if 99% of his constituents wanted GMO labeling, that would not become a reality because it goes against his own moral values. Those moral values I later found out were that he works with a farmer who rents his land and grows genetically modified canola, and he makes royalties off of that every single year. He also was visited by prominent shills within industry and was told all of the positives, quote unquote, about genetically modified foods. The same day that I was there lobbying, the one day out of the entire year, Bayer and Syngenta were also in Parliament, and they're there over 200 days a year, talking to our government officials. Why is it that corporations have more say in our livelihoods, in our lives, in our health, in our environment, than we do as citizens? That is the very problem with our democracy right now, is that us as citizens who, technically speaking, we are the government. We elect our officials. We are the constituents that should be deciding on these matters, and yet we're given the least amount of voice in all of the system. And to go one step further, our generation, the young people, are being faced with the consequences of this now more than ever. We have grown up in the age of climate change. We have grown up in the age of our oceans rising, of our oceans acidifying, of excess fertilizers and herbicides in our water systems that are too toxic to drink. We have grown up where Indigenous people are suppressed and oppressed. We have grown up in political and economic overturn, and now more than ever, we are seeing the consequences. And that's why we are standing up. But it's a sad time when the state of our democracy is placed only on the shoulders of young people. We have reached a time where people of older generations in our governments are relying on us to take to the streets, are relying on us to be activists so that we can solve the problems. And we're more than willing to lead the way, I can tell you that much. That's why there were over 15,000 people at Queen's Park marching. That's why there were over 500,000 people in Montreal. That's why there were over millions of people marching for climate action. And not just climate on fossil fuels, but climate understanding that industrial agriculture is a part of that our diet plays such a huge role. We are out there making the difference, but we need your help. We can't do this alone. And if we're going to uphold democracy, we need to question why our media is being influenced, why there are blackouts on topics like GMOs. We need to question why advertising is having more influence. And I'm a journalism student, so good luck to me getting a job after saying all of this. But the reality is that there's no time to be quiet. There's no time to not be controversial. Because if we allow industry, if we allow government to suppress our voices, nothing will ever be changed. As an activist, I have experienced the outcome of industry and governments trying to silence us. When I was 14, Monsanto and other biotech corporations were sending emails back and forth to PR companies saying that they wanted to discredit me and discredit everything that I've worked towards. At 14, they were already plotting to destroy the credibility of a young activist. Just a few weeks ago, more information came out. I crashed a Monsanto shareholder meeting a few years ago, and they weren't happy about that. And so those emails came out recently. And it shows you that even activism in your own small way is creating massive waves. They are scared of activism because activism and journalism is what holds up democratic values. Without activists and without journalists, change is never made. And I beg all of you to take action now. We are all a part of this democracy. We all have a say. And every decision you make is a vote for the kind of world that we want to see. Like I said, there isn't time to be complacent anymore. I refuse to be, and I hope that all of you do as well. We need to challenge the idea that we don't have diversity within our governments. If there isn't diversity, then it isn't a true democracy, because representation is more important now than ever. If there isn't the right to know what's in our food. If we don't have the ability to choose the food that we're putting in our bodies, there isn't a true democracy, because we aren't able to vote for the kind of world that we want to see. So I encourage you, when we go home today, to think about everything that you've learned. And don't just think about it in theory. Don't just think about it in the idea of democracy or the constitution of democracy, but think about what you can do when you go home to protect my future, to protect your grandchildren's future, to protect generations to come. Think about how you can support us, how you can push us up, push our voices up. We all need to be involved. This issue of democracy, this issue of industrial agriculture, this issue of climate change is not a one-generational issue. We all walk this planet, we all live here, and it's time for all of us to uphold these values. And I hope that you will all get involved in the most expressive and use your voice the most that you can. So please feel free to join us in our efforts and our causes. You can follow me at Rachel's News. Make sure that you're involved with Kids' Right to Know. Make sure that you're involved with protecting our future. Come out to the next climate strike. Come out to the next march against Monsanto. Make sure that you're voting with your dollar, buying organic when possible, telling your governments that you expect more of them, demanding more, because it's time that they start serving us instead of the corporations. It's time that they start looking out for our futures instead of just the economy, because if we look at the economy without looking at the environment, there is no future. And at the end of the day, as Jane was saying, the future is working with nature and not against it. Thank you.
Come sit over here.